right, good afternoon. That was really tepid, but you will have more opportunities to participate. I'm here to talk about unconscious bias. And I imagine that this is a term you've probably heard a lot recently, so we're going to unpack this term just a bit in the 10 minutes that I have. So to start out, I am going to invite you to go on a thought experiment with me. I want you to imagine that you are a proto-human evolving on the African savanna. Now, you, unlike other proto-humans, you're incredibly progressive, and you decide on this day you are going to slow down and be thoughtful about your decisions. So you look out across the horizon, and you see an animal coming toward you. It is moving quickly. It has 4 legs. It is larger than a hyena. It is smaller than a hippo. And before you get much further, you are well on your way to looking like dinner. So we are all the heirs of the monkeys that had the very quick ability to process data. We are not the strongest, we're not the fastest, we didn't have the biggest claws, but what we did have was the ability to band together in small groups and to quickly process the information that came toward us. And that's how our unconscious biases actually evolved. So if we flash forward to today, we live in a world that is arguably safer, but certainly more complex in many ways. And so we have so much information coming at us. In fact, we have about 11 million bits that come to us every moment. And of that, we are only able to process about 40 bits consciously. And that means that the vast majority, 99.99996%, are processed unconsciously. So if we think about these, what are these unconscious biases? Well, I'm going to do another experiment. This is going to be an opportunity for you to show me that you really actually can participate, to think about what these biases look like. We have these unconscious associations. So simple exercise. You're going to see 2 categories like these 2. They should be really familiar to you. A word is going to appear in the middle. Now, if that word is strongly associated with the right side, you say right. Can I hear that? Right. OK. Strongly associated with the left side, you say left. Left. Awesome. Say it again. Right? Right. Left. Awesome. OK. First one. Left. All right. Easy, right? We're going to do this again. Same idea, different categories. OK? These should be familiar as well. Again, same thing. Now you guys are pros, so we're going to make it a little bit more complex. We're actually going to have 2 categories on each side. And so the word in the middle is going to associate with either of those 2 categories. Same thing, right, left, right, left. Try it again. That seemed to have gotten a little bit more complicated for all of you. All right, we'll give you one more opportunity to do it. Same exercise, 2 categories. Word's going to come in the middle. Ready? So you probably noticed that it got a little harder when you got to that last set of categories. And that's because we have been exposed to a lifetime of associations between certain categories and other categories. And that's really how our unconscious biases form. So when we think about gender, we have assumptions that we have made about gender or images that we've seen. And that's why it was more uncomfortable. I heard some giggling. It got fun. And those are our unconscious biases firing. So I have a simple definition that I like to use for unconscious bias. So our unconscious biases are the blind spots that occur because of errors in the way that we process data. Now, there are a couple things about this definition that are really important. The first is that you'll notice that our unconscious biases, they're neither positive nor negative. All right, we can have positive assumptions about groups. We can have negative assumptions about groups. Both can be unconscious, and both play out. And also, this is a processing error. It means that it's something that we do because we are human beings and the way that we process data. We can actually even think about it as a firmware problem for us. I'm coming from Silicon Valley, so I like to think about all these computer metaphors. But it has some real impacts. Good thing is that if it's a processing error, we like to say in tech, we can debug it. So I want to give you a little bit more, a few more examples about what unconscious bias actually looks like. So different types of unconscious biases. So first example are social biases. Now, example of a social bias would be a similarity or like me bias. We tend to prefer people who are like us. So for me, where this plays out a lot is on schools. I just got back from my college reunion. I'm feeling really good about my college right now, which is the intent of the reunion. They want me to open my checkbook. But if I get a resume from someone who went to my college, I'm going to have a positive feeling toward them that I wouldn't have for someone who didn't have that affinity. So that's an example of a social bias. Another type of a bias is a memory bias. And this has to do with the way we remember data. One interesting memory bias is a hindsight bias. So we actually tend to remember our own history often as a string of incredible successes. But yet we don't remember other people's careers in the same way. That becomes important in the decisions that we make about people. Another example is a decision-making bias. Confirmation bias is the strongest example I like to give of that. We tend to gravitate toward information that confirms what we already believe. And we filter out and find less credible information that is counter to what we believe. And then a final type of bias are probability and belief biases. Now, a probability and belief bias, an example would be the availability heuristic. And what that is we substitute the easily available subset of data for the full set of data. So for example, if I live in a certain neighborhood and everybody in my neighborhood likes the same type of peanut butter, I might assume, hey, everybody likes that type of peanut butter. But really, I'm just substituting that easily available subset of data. So what you could see is that these types of biases, they're not just about how we view people. They're about how we process data. And they can have impacts on how we make selections, on how we see the world. So if I think about some of that impact in an arena that you all are familiar with, I'm going to give you a few examples from Hollywood. How many of you are familiar with these guys? Yeah. Now, Silicon Valley, if you haven't seen it, it's a show that actually satirizes the industry that I work in, which I have to say is really hard because it's almost a satire to begin with. Now, Silicon Valley has gotten a lot of flack for representing Silicon Valley as it is with all men. Now, if we think about why this has happened in Silicon Valley, in tech, it's because of that like me bias, that network effect. You have two guys who start a company, and it's almost always two guys. And then they find more guys that are like them, and more guys that are like them. And then by the time a company gets to the size of Dropbox, where I work now, or Google, they find that they have an incredible diversity problem. Now, the great thing about Hollywood is that you can choose to actually do something different. You don't have to represent the reality. You could represent something aspirational. Show us the computer scientist that we would like to have. And to give an example of some folks in Hollywood I think are doing a great job, I have John Oliver and Samantha Bee. And so for their writers' rooms, they did something different. So first with John Oliver, he had blind submissions so that they didn't know any identifying information about the writers until they were chosen. It was double-blind submissions. Now, the producer of Samantha Bee's show went one step further in that she created a packet for all of the writers that told them exactly the format that their jokes should come in. And what that then did was it corrected for experience, because they could no longer tell who had had a long tenure in a writer's room and who hadn't. So again, creating structures that avoid our bias are one of the best ways to combat them. Now, the reason why we should think about this is that it actually is valuable. Now, how many of you have heard about the Bechdel test? All right, so I see about half people raising their hand. Well, the Bechdel test asks 3 questions about a piece of media. Are there 2 women? And when we say 2 women, characters with names. Do they speak to one another about something that is not a man? Now, you would be surprised. There are a lot of movies, a lot of TV shows, lots of favorites that don't pass it. But what's interesting is I've got some data here about movies that pass the Bechdel test. And they get smaller budgets, right? That might have something to do with the bias, the assumption that people don't want to see movies about women, but they make more revenue. So cheaper movies that make more money. What? They actually get more Metacritic scores, so they're critically more acclaimed. But interestingly, amateur reviewers are less favorable about them. Right? So we can see that biases are playing out in some interesting ways. But there is an upside if we can break through some of those biases. So I want to leave you with a final slide that gives a framework for thinking about how to break bias. So first, we can't, now because our unconscious biases are a processing error, we're actually unable to interrupt our own biases while they are happening. It's a physical constraint. But someone else can help us. So we need to create an environment where we help each other call out those biases. So empower one another to reveal bias. We also need to understand processes and standards. So if we think about what the John Oliver did in his writer's room, or Samantha Bee did in selecting their writer's room, they created structure and criteria to avoid the bias. So you think about where it fires and you plan for it. And then the last thing is, if you know you have triggers, then you come up with some simple retrainings for yourself. You say, if X happens, I will do Y, because you know what your bias is, or you know what your organization's bias is. And with that, I want to thank you for those 10 minutes.